Good afternoon. Thank you everybody for coming today. I'm Tony Zaman. I'm the Communications and Events Manager for the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State. We are very thankful to have you guys here today. We're also thankful for the IPPSR staff for making this possible. Arnold Weinfeld, who helped with sign-in today, and Beverton, Anyanga, who could not be with us. We also like to thank Representative Whitwer and the House Business Office for renting this space to us. It's always a great privilege to be here. We've got a great program today. We jokingly kind of labeled this the professor and the pros, trying to get kind of the academic side on this as well as the nuts and bolts kind of gritty side of it, and we've got a great team here to do that today. From Baldly Bipartisan, we've got John Sellek and Adrian Hemond. They are both wonderful professionals. I think you're going to learn a lot. John, an MSU grad, is the CEO of Harvard Strategic. He was recently named one of Lansing's most effective public affairs professionals by MERS News. John's political and public relations skills come from advising 2 Republican speakers of the House, serving in a governor's policy shop, running public relations for 2 attorneys general, and leading statewide campaigns. John is a regular analyst of Michigan public policy environment for state and national media. Adrian Hemond is CEO of Grassroots Midwest, which he founded in 2013 after acquiring a broad range of expertise in politics and policy. A former political science instructor at Saginaw Valley State University, Hemond was chief of staff to the Michigan House Democratic Minority Leader in 2013. He served as a lobbyist with Government Consultant Services. He's known as one of the most effective political strategists in Michigan. And lastly, our panelist who has probably the most hair on this panel, so we're a little challenged up here, is Dr. Matt Grossmann, one of the country's leading political scientists and director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. Dr. Grossmann also teaches political science at MSU and has led IPPSR since 2016. He has written a number of books, including Red State Blues, Asymmetric Politics, Art of the Possible, and you should be on the lookout for his newest book, Polarized Degrees: How the Diploma Divide and Culture War Transformed American Politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Grossmann.
Thank you. It's not a joke. I do have slides with graphs. There will be a quiz at the end. I am fulfilling the professor role. I'm going to start us off with some national context and a little bit of Michigan geography. So first we're going to watch a little composite history of Michigan politics. This is the presidential vote in the 1992 presidential election. You can see Democrats were winning areas of the Upper Peninsula, large parts of the Upper Northern Peninsula as well. And Republicans were doing well in the suburbs around Detroit. We'll kind of watch this go forward. Don't worry, I'll do it more than once. We get all the way to 2020, and we have essentially just a map of density in Michigan, where the urban areas are Democratic, and as you go further out from them, you get more Republican. This isn't unique to Michigan. This is happening all over the United States, and in fact all over the democratic world, as the parties increasingly divide based on cultural issues compared to economic issues. And if you look at maps of Ontario elections just across the border in Canada, the transition looks pretty similar. So we'll just watch that one more time. Going through to 2020. And this is obviously a map where Biden won, but the Democratic votes were quite a bit more concentrated. And this matters a lot, of course, because our geographic boundaries are relatively stable, and then some can change in the redistricting process. So to give you a little bit on that, these are the House and Senate state results in 2022. You can see they roughly mirror quite closely match the statewide vote for House and Senate. but Democrats are concentrated in those highly populated areas. This wasn't guaranteed to happen. This happened because of the change in the redistricting process. The Democrats had won a higher vote share than seat share in Senate elections for a while, and in House elections for some of the time of the last couple decades, and Republicans were able to still maintain control of those chambers. This time the Democrats slightly won the statewide vote and slightly got majorities in the House and Senate. They're not guaranteed to last because the House is back up this time. And it required quite a bit of change. This is from an analysis of the redistricting process that we did. This is just one metric, but here 0% would mean that it was completely even, meaning if there was a 50-50 statewide vote, then Republicans and Democrats would be equally likely to win control of the House or Senate. And this is a computer simulation where we had a computer draw 10,000 randomly drawn districts, district maps in the state of Michigan. Having no information other than just equal population districts. So if you just tell a computer just to draw district maps on Michigan and you see what the results are, what you see is that every one of those maps favors Republicans. That has to do with the same geography that I just showed you. Because Democrats are more geographically concentrated than Republicans, most maps that you draw in Michigan would be Republican favoring maps. So there's two stories about the redistricting process that the parties tell, and both are true. Democrats say that the commission went out of its way to try to reach completely fair on these fairness metrics and got pretty close but not all the way. So the maps still slightly favor the Republicans. The Republicans say that the commission went out of its way to draw maps that were favorable to Democrats compared to maps that would be drawn without any partisan information. Also true. The maps that they drew were about as favorable to Democrats as you could be, and they also were very close to fair in the partisan metrics. Now, we can get pretty close because people's votes across lots of different offices are, of course, very highly correlated. This is a summary of elections for the last 100 years. Higher on this map means the Democrats made gains, lower means that the Republicans made gains, and there's two lines here reporting the overall national results. The dashed line is how much Democrats gained or lost in each election year in the U.S. House of Representatives. The solid line is how much Democrats gained or lost in all lower chambers of state legislatures nationwide. So a couple things that stand out about this chart. Number one is that they're obviously extremely closely correlated at well above 0.9. So when the Democrats are doing well in U.S. House elections, they're also doing well in state legislative elections. Another thing that you might notice is that it is very bumpy or negatively serial correlated, which just means that whoever won one election is favored to lose the next election. That is especially true when it comes to the presidential election followed by the midterm election. But you can see that we actually are swinging a little bit less in recent years than we used to swing from one election to another because we hardly ever have the kind of blowout elections that we used to have and the swings that we had from one decade to another. Democrats won the 1964 presidential election by 23 points, then Republicans won the 1972 presidential election by 23 points. We're not having those kinds of swings like we used to. We're much closer to 50-50 nationwide. But we still do have some people in the middle who move back and forth and some people who decide to only turn out in some elections and not others. And that produces our potential for lots of change from one election to another. Now, you might hope that we have state legislators that are going to be judged on what happens here at the Capitol in Lansing, but that is not necessarily the case. So this is two pieces of information you might want to know to judge how someone is going to vote in their state legislative race, whether they'll vote for the Democrat or Republican in their state legislative race. One piece of information you might want to know is whether they approve of things happening in the state legislature. What's going on in Lansing, do you approve or disapprove of that? And that does tell you a very small amount about whether they will support the Democratic candidate, the person, the party that's in charge of the state legislature. It moves you from about a 0.5, a 50% chance of voting for the Democrats or Republicans if you really hate what's going on in the legislature, to a 60% chance if you really love what's going on in the legislature. But look at that other line. This is the other piece of information you might want to know. Whether they like or don't like, whether they approve or don't approve of Joe Biden's performance of the presidency. Okay, you might think that has nothing to do with what your state legislator is doing. Voters don't agree. If they really dislike what Joe Biden is doing, they have a 20% chance of voting for their state legislative Democratic candidate. And if they really love what Joe Biden is doing, they have an 80% chance, according to this analysis. So this isn't, of course, unique to Democrats. This is the same thing that's true in every election. Republican state legislators were dependent on their voter support or disapproval of Donald Trump, and Democratic state legislators are dependent on their voter support or dislike of Joe Biden. So here's where the race stands. According to 538's current metrics in Michigan, Trump is slightly ahead, roughly matching, maybe a little bit higher than his national lead. And you can see we have a greater than normal level of support for a third-party candidate, at least so far. So big picture here, we're running the same election that we ran last time, but with Joe Biden less popular. So this is from some Gallup polls, which just asked people a bunch of questions in 2020 and 2024. Are the candidates an effective manager? Last time Joe Biden has an advantage, this time he has a disadvantage. Is he more likable? He's still more likable, but he goes down. You can see Donald Trump's numbers from 2020 and 2024 are basically staying the same across the board. It's Joe Biden's that have declined across the board, so he no longer has an advantage on judgment. He never had an advantage on being strong and decisive, but he's lower. Cares about people like me, that's the traditional Democratic advantage. He's only a little bit above Trump there, and still a little bit above Trump for honest and trustworthy, the only place where Trump has gone down a little bit. So we're running the same election. We aren't going to have completely the same voters. We had record high turnout last time, unlikely to be matched this time. So there will be some differences, but for the most part, big picture difference is voters are choosing between the same two candidates. But last time Joe Biden had an advantage in terms of his favorability, and he no longer has that advantage. So more people are selecting between two candidates that they don't like. Michigan has a very high chance of being the tipping point state in this election. That doesn't just mean that we're a swing state that could go either way. It means that if the election were to come down to one state, we are very likely to be that state, or at least in the top three likelihood of being that state. That is because Trump has made more gains in the three southern swing states than he has in the three northern swing states, so Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. He has had an increase in his performance compared to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which of course remain the three states that are competitive in the north in a 50-50 national election. We're the three states to swing to Trump in 2016 and then swing back in 2020. We're still competing with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. They're about equally likely to be the tipping point state as us at the moment, but I think you would bet on us or Wisconsin being the tipping point state. It's not the first time we've been the tipping point state. We actually were the tipping point state in 1984 and 1988. It's just that neither Ronald Reagan nor H.W. Bush really needed us. But if the election had come down to one state in those elections, we would have been it. So we've been mirroring the national trends for a while, and we've remained competitive. But we're really at the top of the national context today. That's also true in congressional elections. We have a top-tier Senate race. That's one of the top 7 Senate races. I actually am on the side of making Michigan more of a toss-up compared to the national prognosticators. because it is a race between two quality candidates in a swing state where you can't imagine the U.S. Senate candidates getting a lot of support from people who don't support their party's presidential nominee. But national prognosticators usually have us in the lean Democratic category. We also have two of the top 10 or 20 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives as well, and the two open House seats among them. So we are likely to be competitive and important across the board. The shifts so far are pretty clear demographically in the polls, and a lot of people don't believe them at the moment. But I will repeat what is occurring across polls, which is that Donald Trump, relative to Joe Biden, is doing better among young people than he did last time, and is doing better among Black and Hispanic voters than he did last time. That's actually why the southern states have moved more towards Trump than the northern states, because we are older and whiter than the southern swing states. So if you don't believe these demographic shifts, then you might also not necessarily want to believe that the southern states southern swing states will maintain in Trump's favor. Now, it might seem like this is anomalous or couldn't happen. I don't think that that's the case. Young people are not actually very firm in their partisanship, meaning that they do move back and forth between elections between the parties more than other voters, and Black and Hispanic voters include lots of swing voters. In fact, the swing minority voter in the United States is more likely to be moderate and even more likely to be conservative than the swing white voters because of changes in the party's ideological coalitions. So Democrats maintain support from Black voters who self-identify as conservative, have conservative positions on social issues, and have conservative positions on economic issues. So in order to maintain such high levels of support among African American and Hispanic voters, Democrats have to continue to win conservative or moderate leaning minority voters. Now you might say we should not trust the polls. No one answers their phone. No one is willing to talk to us. It's all unrepresentative. Well, the last election we had historically great polls. Now that doesn't mean they were great. We always have error in our polling, but the polls on average across races were off by 2.4 percentage points in the last election. And they had a slight bias of half a point towards the Democrats across all races. That doesn't mean they called every single race effectively. In fact, we had some Senate elections where the Republicans did worse than expected, and that made a difference in the national electorate. But it doesn't mean the polls overall were bad. The polls have consistently been about the same across different elections, and in the last election were actually better than normal. We also can't predict the direction of error. So everybody wants to say, well, the polls were off by this much. If you're a Democrat, you'll take a year when the polls favor Republicans slightly, and you'll say, let's adjust the polls in our direction. If you're a Republican, you'll say, oh, these polls are always off in elections where Trump is on the ballot, so they're underestimating Trump. It could be, but we don't know that in advance. The polling error goes in both directions. In Michigan, for example, the polls were off in favor of Democrats in a consequential way, obviously, in 2016. They were also off in 2020 in favor of Democrats, but in 2012 and 2008, they were off in favor of Democrats. I'm sorry, in favor of Republicans. They thought that Republicans would do better than they actually did in Michigan. So the polls are always off by some amount. And in fact, they're always systematically off. It's never just the case that they're off just from bias in the sampling method. But they aren't off consistently in the same direction from one election to another. So I can tell you what the polls say today. I cannot tell you which way they'll be off in this election, but they have been relatively accurate in recent elections. All right, thanks.
All right, we'll be handing out the quiz like the professor said. Thank you, Dr. Grossmann. As you all know, it is summer blockbuster season. And so the first question is, how did we get a sequel to the 2020 presidential race when no one seemed to want one?
Well, the two major American political parties, as you may have noticed, are very bad at delivering things that Americans want, and their nominees for president are no different. One of the things that you see pretty consistently in public opinion polling in this country is that the two political parties are largely reviled by Americans. They think that they do a bad job of producing effective public policy, and it turns out that they think they do a bad job of producing major party nominees for the presidency as well.
And otherwise, we simply are seeing the traditional sitting president having almost no difficulty or no opposition through a primary season. We haven't gotten to that point in America where there's heavy-duty competition for an incumbent in office. And from the Republican side, obviously, Donald Trump, the party is his. It is the MAGA party. He's the leader of it. He did not choose to go away like candidates in the past who were done and went on to something else. He kept building his block of power. So it became very hard for anyone to truly challenge or beat them, despite the fact that a whole lot of money was spent on the Republican side of the primaries, and all to no end.
In your opinion, why has President Biden's campaign kind of failed to launch so far this year? It seems like he's a little bit behind where you would think he would be as a sitting incumbent.
Well, they started real late. Michigan's pretty good evidence of that. They didn't start staffing that campaign up for real until less than 2 months ago. Normally for a presidential campaign in a swing state, you would have been doing that in September or maybe October of last year. They didn't get started until springtime this year in Michigan, which is, I think the technical term is dumb. And so they've had some missteps. They've also had some missteps in that until very recently, the president in his public appearances was not talking very much about the issues that Americans continue to tell pollsters are top of mind for them. And I think that's the other reason that this campaign has failed to launch from the Biden side. And then the third reason is there's been a fundamental misunderstanding from the Biden campaign about what this campaign is. If this campaign is a referendum on Joe Biden, he will lose, full stop. If it's a choice between him and Donald Trump, he has a chance. And they have not done a good job until very, very recently of trying to frame this as a choice between these two old men that Americans hate. And so Americans have viewed it as a referendum on the Biden presidency, which they do not like.
Yeah, I would echo a little bit about what Adrian started off with, which is, it's kind of hard to believe, to be honest. So when I talked about the incumbency advantage for sitting presidents, that also involves the advantage of staff and experts and money. All the things that he had, he basically just threw away. It's hard to tell why, but sometimes it's as simple as he just wasn't up to that task, didn't feel like going out and doing it. He was doing the old traditional thing of having his campaign office in his home state, so they had like a tiny place in Delaware where nobody could even get to very easily. It was 2 hours out of the Philadelphia airport. To even get there, it's as if he wanted to keep all of his top advisors with him in the White House. Where if you look at all the previous presidents, but just look at his example, President Obama, there are full books written about how the top advisors, who are now famous and still on TV to this day, all packed up a year ahead of time, got the heck out of Washington and went to Chicago and set up massive operations, data operations, all those good things that the Biden campaign didn't. And I actually stumbled on a little bit myself when I posted a job for our business at Harvard a couple months ago. And what I ran across on Indeed were like 80 job listings for the Biden campaign. In 2024, like that kind of blew my mind a little bit. And so that shows the problems they have there. Now that doesn't mean the GOP doesn't have problems getting set up. They went through a huge crisis with their state party. They didn't really have it. They didn't have a state party until more recently again. It kind of got functioning again. And so they're dependent on what the Trump team is able to fund through the RNC and what they're willing to commit to in Michigan. But I think the flip side for the Dems, as we start off talking about why is Biden slow, I would probably argue that the state level Democrats, led by Governor Whitmer, the huge advantage that they have at their state Democratic Party in getting organized and doing things, that has actually been taken advantage of. They know there was no help coming from the Joe Biden White House, so they've been out setting up volunteer offices, doing earned media hits around those, trying to get volunteers to come out. They're going to try to counter the energy behind Trump with their own actual organization, which they're capable of doing because they have a super popular, super good fundraising, politically oriented governor as their leader.
And I don't mean to undermine the strategy discussions, but I do think it's useful to just set the parameters that this is an economy that voters don't like. Americans do not like the post-COVID inflationary economy. They haven't liked it for some time, and they're no different than voters around the world. President Biden is actually doing slightly better than most international leaders. Incumbent parties have been losing elections and are set to lose more this year by margins greater than Democrats have any chance of losing this election. So the strategy considerations do matter, but the effect of overall economic sentiment on presidential approval and Biden's reelection prospects is in the very normal range.
The thing is on that, the president went into the State of the Union address kind of like limping along. A lot of people were nervous on the Democratic side how he would perform. And if you watched it, and I'm sorry if you did, if you watch any State of the Union address, it's tough sledding, stay awake. The Republicans went into that actual speech on national TV hoping to throw him off. They were shouting at him, they were calling names, they were doing all kinds of games. Yet he actually was up for it, and some people say he was up for it because he took Adderall or something else, and I want
Colombian agribusiness.
But he actually got engaged. He is like a one-on-one kind of retail politician. It actually lifted him up, and we heard less discussion about age as a primary issue after the State of the Union than we did before. So they did pick up their campaigning after that, but I still feel they didn't do enough. And so that is, I think, why we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, why they jumped ahead on the debate issue. But certainly in the question about why is Biden struggling, the economy for sure, just one example of polling numbers from CBS News that came out 2 weeks ago. They asked voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin if they thought the economy was worse now than before the pandemic. And in Michigan, 50% thought it was worse. In Pennsylvania, 50% thought it was worse. And in Wisconsin, 48% thought it was worse. So yes, no matter how many random numbers they throw at voters, they're the ones still paying $85 to fill their gas tank, $4 to buy milk, whatever it is, they're the ones still suffering, and those esoteric numbers don't mean anything to them yet.
Kind of leading on to something you were talking about, John, how big an advantage right now do the Michigan Dems have over the MIGOP with kind of that loss here organization? Is that something that the MIGOP can make up, or is that just going to be a deciding factor in this election come November?
The one thing that Republicans seem to have in a lot of the polls that we see is they have more energy, their voters are more excited to get out and vote than Democrats, and that's just a human nature thing. When your team is going to win, or it looks like it's going to win, it's a lot easier to get volunteers in the door. When everybody's sort of depressed at what's going on at the top of your ticket, then they're not going to show up. But time is the most important thing in all campaigns, in my opinion, more so than money or other things that we hear about, because there's a finite number of days, minutes, and seconds between now and election day. You can't get it back. And so the Michigan GOP lost a lot of time because of the first chair that was elected for this cycle did not know what she was doing, whether you like her or not, think she was a good thing for the party or not. She sure is not an operative. That was her calling card, and it turned out you need to be an operative or know how to hire the right operatives to run a party. It was essentially running out of a single room in a building about a block from here with no volunteers, no money, no computers, no nothing. So to get somebody like Pete Hoekstra, the former congressman and U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands, he kind of knows what he's doing, and he has a foot in both camps of sort of mainstream GOP, where he came from originally, and Trump world. So it's probably the best the GOP could ask for, and they're going to operate from behind in getting set up. It doesn't mean they can't catch up, but they are behind, because when you have a state party with a stable group of operatives who are probably considered to be quality operatives, LeVar Burns and others, who've been plotting and planning all along regardless of what Joe Biden is doing, they've got the leg up for now.
So Matt, on election night this year, obviously there's always a group of pivotal voters that we need to look at. Which counties, if we're looking at which way Michigan's going to go, where should we be looking this year to kind of say, okay, this is where the race is headed?
I don't know that there's necessarily one county level that is important. Reporters are asking me a very similar question, so I should have a better answer. But if you look at the map that I just showed you of like Oakland and Macomb County, which people are familiar with seeing as the counties that are moving in different directions, You can see that actually they both have the same structure. The closer you are to Detroit, the more Democratic the voting is, and the further off that you get it, the more Republican the voter is. So if you want to know where the swing voters and swing areas are, you just have to go at the line between the suburbs and the exurbs. Anywhere in Michigan, you can just go out to Haslett here, and rather than look at countywide returns, because it's sort of at that border. And it's even true in northern Michigan. The closer you live, even in small towns, the closer you live to the post office or the downtown or city hall, the more likely you are to be a Democrat, and the further you live from other people, the more likely you are to be a Republican. So if you get in that intermediary range, you're more likely to see swing voters.
I think you can see some of that from a practical standpoint, and I might actually let Adrian talk in a minute, but in 2016 and even into 2020, when Donald Trump started coming to Michigan, a lot of Africans at first were like, wait a minute, because your George W. Bush and Mitt Romney Republicans, when they came to Michigan, they went straight for the suburbs. They went to Kent County around Grand Rapids. They went to Oakland County around Detroit. And when Trump came, he went to Saginaw and Cadillac. And at first, a lot of people were like, what are they doing? Well, they saw in their data the transformation that was ongoing but accelerating for those voters in counties where Trump was getting 60 and even a little bit of 70% in that kind of like northern rural area away from Lincoln, Michigan. When Trump came back most recently, he did go over to Grand Rapids to take advantage of the unfortunate murder incident that happened with an illegal immigrant there. But his real visit that he plotted out and planned again went back to Freeland, which is in that nook between Flint and Saginaw and Bay City. So he's still trying to push that. Over the weekend, he went to the Bronx. And people are like, wait a minute, what is he doing? He's from New York City, he's from Manhattan, why did he go to the Bronx? Well, to me, I think that's probably indicating a little bit to us that they are seeing that movement amongst Hispanic and to some extent black voters. But Hispanic voters make up a massive part of the population, almost 60% of the Bronx, and that's why he went and plopped down there. I think we probably can compare his visits to Saginaw and the Tri-Cities to what he did in the Bronx.
Yeah, and there's something interesting going on specific to that I think a lot of people ignore, especially Democrats, frankly, because it's uncomfortable. Part of what Donald Trump capitalized on so successfully in 2016, and clearly his campaign is trying to capitalize on again, is this sort of cultural divide amongst voters that appears to underlie a lot of the realignment that we're seeing in the country right now. And people think that that's directly related to race. I would argue that it's not. People sometimes argue that it's related to people's economic position. I would argue that it's not. It's related to culture, right? We hear a lot about how living close to an institution of higher learning is a big driver of how likely you are to be a Democrat. There is a perception amongst a large portion of this country that overeducated elites, like the four people who are sitting up here talking to you right now, look down on the way that they live. And they are not wrong, right? And that is associated with the Democratic brand. That is part of what Democrats are fighting against, and it's part of what Donald Trump has been so successful at capitalizing on, is most Americans do not go to college, and they think that all of us look down on them for it. And they're probably right.
In that same vein, Adrian, in regards to the Democrat coalition, we know that Biden has a problem with economic perception. Does he also have a Kennedy problem?
I mean, so John and I do this little podcast. We had Jonathan Martin, reporter from Politico, on a few weeks ago. And he made what I think is the very astute point that both campaigns, both parties, are busily trying to weaponize the Kennedy candidacy against each other. And it's an open question who's going to be most successful with that. We've seen some change in the public opinion polling, even just in the last 6 months, in terms of which of the two major party candidates is hurt most by having RFK Jr. on the ballot. Initially, it appeared to be Joe Biden, then it shifted over to Donald Trump. It appears maybe like it's kind of a jump ball right now, although it's really too early to tell. Certainly from a sort of policy and public branding perspective, you would think that he would harm Donald Trump a little bit more, particularly around like vaccine and COVID issues. I'm not 100% convinced of that, but I do think that Democrats are better positioned to weaponize the Kennedy candidacy because they have more money and they're better organized right now. And they also have the They also have a super unpopular incumbent. And so I think that they ultimately will be a little bit more successful in weaponizing Kennedy, but very open question. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think it's very similar, and both sides are trying to weaponize it. Earlier in the year, or maybe late last year, the National Democratic Party feared Kennedy so much they hired an entire crew of PR folks, some who got their start in the Pete Buttigieg campaign and were famous for making a lot of noise in earned media, and that's Liz Smith, and she lumped together a whole bunch of local people in every area that Kennedy goes to and does what we call bracketing, like what Tony used to do at the state party. You have somebody show up before the event that happens, and you have them be available after the event to shoot it down. And we have a state legislator who's rising as a star amongst Democrats, State Senator Mallory McMorrow. She's participated in that, and you've seen her show up in these national stories. You're like, wait a minute, why is Mallory McMorrow in the story in Nebraska, or wherever the heck Kennedy happened to be at the time? And it's because the Dems took it that seriously. Now we've started to see evidence of polling that shows it's taking a chunk out of Trump, so it's kind of going back and forth. So I think you're right that Jonathan Martin's observation that whoever can figure out how to weaponize him and use him the best will come out ahead. But his kind of conspiracy theory feelings probably lends himself more to taking Trump words, is my guess.
Dr. Grossmann, what does polling tell us about, and history for that matter, about these third-party candidates?
Well, there's no consistent, as they said, there's no consistent evidence that he's currently hurting one candidate more than the other, and no consistency across states in even which candidate is the second preference of Kennedy voters. But he will be on the ballot in Michigan. Swing states usually have lower levels of third-party support. But there, is not necessarily consistency. It was true last time that the Libertarian candidate took more from Trump than Biden. It was true that third-party candidates in 2016 took more from Clinton. But it's not always in one direction or the other. The other thing is I have been interested in this claim that I and quite a few other people make that third-party candidates lose support as Election Day approaches. As an extremely broad point, you can say that, but it's not necessarily the case. Perot gained a little bit in '96 at the end. Nader stayed about the same through 2000. So there's not, and Wallace gained throughout the campaign. So there's not necessarily as consistent of a historical pattern as you might expect. And actually, at this point in the election, if you have third-party candidates polling at Kennedy's level, they're likely to get some. Now, that polls usually outguess third-party candidates by 1 or 2 percentage points, but it doesn't seem as consistent as I thought it was, that you would expect him to go down to almost nothing by election day.
Now, it looks like Kennedy right now, if you look at the polling, he's kind of on the edge there of making that debate stage. With Perot in '92, he of course was on the stage. Is that kind of a make or break thing for him? Is that exposure, or is it not a big a deal?
The debates can be very important for third-party candidates, but we have a whole fun history of litigation that you can read where everyone says that they're abiding by various polling metrics, and really the two parties are just agreeing or not agreeing to have the third-party candidate participate, and right now it doesn't look like they want it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I would be shocked to see RFK Jr. on a debate stage. Frankly, if I were involved in either of those presidential campaigns, I would never agree to that.
The Lansing-centric news outlet called MERS put out an alert while we've been sitting here about a poll that they are releasing today from Steve Mitchell's polling firm that showed Trump up by 2 when it's just a head-to-head. And then when they add in Stein and Kennedy, it becomes Trump plus 1. So like we're dealing like way inside the margin of error, but they're not. He only got 5%. That was lower than we've seen in a lot of other cases. Kennedy.
Before we leave the presidential race, one last question. Biden defeated Trump by over 154,000 votes. Now, granted, there was a 71% voter turnout here in Michigan, which is very, very, very high. How does Trump make up a deficit of that size in the state?
I don't know that he has to. For starters, I don't think turnout is going to be anywhere near 71% this time. That would be shocking. 2020 just in general was an extremely anomalous election that I think it's hard to draw a lot of conclusions from. Like, talk about outliers in your data, like that's 2020. I don't think he has to make it all up. I think a lot fewer people are going to show up to vote this time. I think the electorate is going to look a lot different in terms of who does show up. The electorate's going to be a lot older than it was in 2020, or especially in 2022. And I think so I don't think he has to make all that up. He has to turn his partisans out to vote, and he's got to find a way to continue to keep up this frame of the election being a referendum on Joe Biden. I think one of the things that has helped Donald Trump a lot up until this point in the campaign is that he has been, and this all has to be couched, right? Everything's relative. He's been pretty normal through this one compared to the 2020 and 2016 campaigns. Certainly, the operatives around him have been much more disciplined than they were in the last two elections. And he's just got to keep this frame up that Joe Biden sucks, you should want somebody else, right? And be as restrained as he possibly can in how he messages. Now, we are talking about Donald J. Trump, so that's actually way harder than it sounds, right? Restraint is not something that comes naturally to him. But I think if he gets out of his own way, you have to call him a pretty decent favorite to win.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and we've seen a lot of reduction in voting in a lot of cities with majority black voting populations. Certainly Barack Obama, the first time he ran, was off the charts in the city of Detroit, 324,000 votes there. It's a huge cushion to try to make up. Even he dropped down to about 280 in his reelect, but Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden dropped significantly more than that into basically around 420,000, I think. I don't have it in front of me. So they're losing a lot of excitement there, and then you couple that with the sort of disinterest that a lot of African American voters are feeling about Team Biden. You have elected leadership amongst Democrats, African American leadership in Southeast Michigan, who are writing opinion pieces and doing interviews saying that Joe Biden just doesn't get it. That, like, the Wayne County Executive Warren Evans essentially wrote in like 700 words, he basically could have just said, dude, I'm dying out here, give me something to work with. Like, you can't convince people to want to vote or support Biden or get excited to come out. And then you see Trump moving into these areas and trying to coach some of that vote. And if we're going to be in a super close election, a percentage or two difference here and there will actually make an impact. There was also a big set of polling that came out today in the Detroit News by a respected pollster named Richard Schuba and Glenn Garriff Group. It was released in advance of the big fancy Detroit Chamber of Mackinac Policy Conference that's starting as we speak up on Mackinac Island. Will go for the next few days. And the overall gist of what they released today was whether people are feeling really confident about democracy, whether they'd be open to authoritarianism to get stuff done because they're sick of nothing happening. 34% of black voters respond in this poll, it really doesn't matter to them what form of government exists. And that, to me, is a sign that people are just frustrated that nothing ever happens, so who cares?
It's the thing I was talking about earlier. There is a large swath of this country that is convinced that people like us in this room don't care about them and look down on the way that they live, and they're responding to that when they're asked about it.
And not everything has changed. There's plenty of moderate to conservative-leaning voters who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and are disappointed with his performance. And they're the swing voters, and they can swing the other way. So there's not a problem. There's not a problem with Donald Trump's potential to win that many votes should he need them.
Moving over to the federal Senate, right now everyone has this pretty much a two-way race between Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slock. And is there anything that Sandy Penciller and Hill Harper can do to get back into these primaries and challenge the front runners here?
No.
That's probably the answer, except one of those guys has a lot more money than Hill Harper, and his name is Sandy Penciller, so he's already running ads trying to pull down Mike Rogers. And the problem is that he's conducting this test of how much money could you waste or spend of your own if you were trying to counter the Trump endorsement and see if you can make an impact. And there hasn't been a single poll that shows there's any impact helping Sandy Penciller despite the millions of dollars he's on his way to spending right now. I can tell you that if Adrian and I and I could probably speak for the professor, if we suddenly had $80 to $100 million, this was the last boondoggle we're gonna throw our money at on this front. So like there are people out there, God bless them, that wanna serve and spend their money, but there haven't been too many instances, or maybe none, where a Trump endorsement in a big race like this was successfully countered. So I think Mike Rogers is gonna probably deal with a lot more slings and arrows and annoyances going forward in this primary than Melissa Slotkin will, because Hill Harper simply doesn't have the funds, or the Dean doesn't have the funds, or haven't shown that they have the funds to really make an impact. I think for Slotkin, her issue again goes back to what we've been talking about with Black Voter. She said in an article in Bridge, Michigan today, I've never represented anybody from the city of Detroit. Her congressional district, like kind of into Oakland County, and she's just buried in that media market. She's a Lansing-based member of Congress. You don't really know who she is, and you can see the efforts there. They're doing all the stuff you do in a campaign where they sat around and, oh my God, we've got to get voters in Detroit to like us. What can we do? They're like putting out like these blocks of endorsements from pastors from the city of Detroit that they went and found all day. Then they'll come back and go, oh, I'm going to introduce a new piece of legislation. Now that she is 5 years into being in Congress, she's going to start paying attention to those things, and that just sets it up for Hill Harper to just keep needling and bothering her as she goes along. But that's an issue for her too. Her first television ad just went onto the air. So with this massive financial advantage, she is trying to finally start trying to define herself, because neither Mike Rogers or Alyssa Slotkin are really known statewide. They all, at max, they have around 50% name ID, and that doesn't even mean that they're actually even people have a good opinion of them yet, right? So in the past, her election started off with her talking about healthcare, which was a go-to Democrat issue. She had a real personal story about her mom's experience with breast cancer and bankruptcy and insurance. It was very effective for her to win this congressional seat that was essentially like a Trump seat. This first ad that came out instead says, I've worked for 2 presidents, I'm bipartisan. So if that doesn't tell Joe Biden that she does not trust him, I don't know what else does.
Yeah, I mean, the president is an anchor around the neck of Democrats down the ticket, and it gets worse the further down the ticket you get, right? As John pointed out, neither of the 2 presumptive nominees for the major parties for U.S. Senate here has particularly stellar name ID statewide. They both represented essentially the same area of the state when they're in Congress. Former Congressman Rogers, that was a decade ago. Congresswoman Slotkin's at least current, so maybe a slight advantage to her there with the people who do know who she is. And that problem just gets worse and worse the further down the ticket you go, and it's a problem that is mostly borne by Democrats right now, because for as unpopular as Donald Trump is, and give the man his due, he's deeply unpopular, Joe Biden is even more unpopular right now. And so if you're a Democrat and people don't know who you are, that's where the real problem starts. So it makes sense that Congresswoman Slotkin is trying to position herself as bipartisan at a time when both major party nominees are pretty unpopular, in an effort to build her name ID with people who maybe have not been represented by her before, or who haven't lived in one of the media markets where millions of dollars in ads have been run for her before. But it's the problem only gets worse the further down the ticket you go.
But Republicans got lucky in the Senate race. Donald Trump doesn't like Peter Meyer, so he endorsed a very non-Trumpy quality candidate for statewide office. Remember, we just had an election 2 years ago where all 3 of the statewide candidates lost by more than 10 points compared to the state legislative candidates. So a lot of people voted for the Republican state legislative candidates and voted against all 3 statewide Republican nominees. It was not at all guaranteed that Republicans would have a quality statewide candidate, and they do.
Kind of turning to Mike Rogers there, and that brings up some good points. I mean, you have a Republican who's been out of public service now for the better part of a decade. He is from a party that, I'm about to use a word that some people in the room might not like, kind of more of a George Bush party, than it is a Donald Trump party. How do you make that shift if you're a Mike Rogers out on the stump, or when it comes to kind of reestablishing that fundraising base that you once had? Because a lot of people, even in his district today, don't know who he is any longer.
Well, you point to an interesting issue there. Congressman Rogers has gone in with both feet on the Trump band of Republicanism, because that's what you have to do in today's Republican Party to secure a nomination, to try to get the activist set involved in your campaign. That's where the energy is in the Republican Party right now. The problem is that's not where the money is in politics more broadly. To the extent that there are large dollar donors that want to contribute to the Trumpist brand of Republicanism, they're giving their money to Donald Trump, whether it's to his presidential campaign, his legal defense fund, or all the various and sundry other ways that they make available for you to give money. And that's reflected in the last campaign finance reports in this U.S. Senate race, where Congressman Rogers raised what would be a perfectly acceptable total for a candidate for the U.S. Congress, but not nearly enough money to win a competitive U.S. Senate seat. And so the Trump endorsement, if an endorsement is going to be made, you have to have it as a Republican if you want to secure the nomination. If a Trump endorsement is a possibility, you have to seek it. But it is a little bit of a poison chalice in that, once you get it and thereby secure the nomination, it's not clear where you go for money.
No, I think it's interesting to watch what happened on the Democrat side overall. Huge financial advantage, and that's in part because Debbie Stabenow made sure that the field was mostly cleared and lined up the person amongst this wave of Trump legacy staffers who went out and ran for office across the country. We had two of them in Michigan be successful. We had two members of Congress, Haley Stevens and Alyssa Slotkin. Alyssa Slotkin by far has been the best fundraiser this entire time, so not surprising to see that money. This seat overall is a real hole for national Democrats. Debbie Stabenow is 72 years old. That's past normal retirement age for a lot of people. I would like to be retired by then, but that's not the retirement age in the U.S. Senate. We see plenty of
There's
people.
a retirement age in the U.S. Senate.
We could have seen her serve another 2 terms at least, so another 12 years before she would even be at the upper range of people who start leaving the Senate.
Grassley'd still have her beat.
And had she been winning or running this time, not only wouldn't we be talking about this, but the Democrats would have saved $50–60 million trying to protect a seat they already have now when the U.S. Senate is so closely divided. So it's a huge problem for them that she decided to get smart. I praise her for that and go out and live a normal life like a regular person instead of staying in the Senate. But it's just created a lot of problems for them as far as party unity and more, especially the amount of money they're spending.
I mean, look, I have enjoyed watching Chuck Grassley learn how to use Twitter. That's been for me. I'm not even gonna lie. For those of you who don't know, I love telling this story. When Chuck Grassley was in the state legislature in Iowa, he served with a man who was a veteran of America's Civil War. That guy was old as hell when Chuck served with him, but he did that. He served with a Civil War veteran of the Iowa legislature. So yeah, she's that is an early retirement for the U.S. Senate. Good for her for doing it.
That's right. Look after her mom.
But Slotkin is very lucky that Republicans have better options nationwide to get control of the U.S. Senate because we're probably not higher than 4th or 5th on the list, and that means she'll probably maintain a money advantage. But there were some Donald Trump, Alyssa Slotkin voters in her U.S. House race, but not a ton, and I don't expect very many in the U.S. Senate race. So if people do tune into this election, it's going to be very close to the presidential race.
Well, I want to dive into that Slotkin House race a little bit, her previous district, which of course she's now running for Senate. But before I do that, another question about Congress, and this one's aimed a little bit more towards the consultants on the stage, just to kind of poo you a little bit. So this year we once again saw a candidate knocked off the ballot for signature issues. Is this a problem in the consulting industry, or does the state require too many signatures to get on the ballot?
Neither. This is a problem with candidates not setting up their campaigns correctly. This is campaign 101. We've had this happen to us as consultants before, where you hire a bunch of people to go out and get signatures for whatever ballot issue. Maybe it's a statewide ballot campaign. Maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe it's a judicial office. So you send these people out to collect signatures, and if you're doing what you're supposed to do, which is checking those signatures against the qualified voter file a couple times a week at a minimum, well, you're going to fire that kid the day after you check those signatures and say, oh, look, these were all done in the same hand, and a bunch of these people don't actually live in the district, and oh, there's a Detroit Free Press reporter's wife on here, maybe I'll call them and find out if they actually signed it. None of that happened. on the congressional campaign that we're talking about down in Southeast Michigan. And frankly, none of that was happening during the signature scandal with all of the Republican gubernatorial candidates that were kicked off the ballot either, right? And ultimately, if you are going to be a candidate for public office, you have a responsibility to set up procedures within your campaign to make sure that you can meet the most basic test for running for office that we set up in our state. And if you flunk, you flunk. Sorry.
Yeah, I do think we have come to a time where we have to question the cost it takes to get these signatures. I mean, the rationale for having them in the first place is to keep every one of us from just filing for U.S. Senate because we feel like it. Let's keep the field narrow to people who can actually organize and have people that actually support them. You know, at the state level, you don't have to do that. You can just pay a fee and you're on it. The field would be gigantic for the U.S. Senate and a lot of other races if we didn't have the signatures. Clearly, an industry moved in that saw candidates who were overwhelmed with manpower and volunteers but had cash. And they took advantage of them repeatedly with these problems. We just saw somebody who served admirably as a Democrat in the state Senate, Adam Hollier, in Detroit running for Congress against Shree Tanner. It shocked me that he ran into this problem. It didn't even turn in the full amount of signatures, I don't think, let alone turn in the right ones. On the other hand, it probably weeded out a few people in the gubernatorial race last time who shouldn't have been on the ticket, even though they were anointed, like James Craig.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and like, as a state, we can make whatever decisions we want in terms of what ballot access looks like. I've heard compelling arguments that, you know, everybody, including judicial nominees, should just be able to pay the $100 and get ballot access. I've heard compelling arguments for the barriers to entry that we erect, but the rules are the rules, right? And I understand that this is not a popular view to take in today's politics, but like, we should all agree that we're gonna follow the effing rules, right? Right?
So if you know somebody, call Adrian. We'll take care of them.
Matt, you had spoken earlier, and moving again to the 7th district, so we're talking about from the Lansing area over to Livingston County, where our current representative, Alyssa Slotkin, is the congresswoman. You talked earlier about those excerpts making the difference in the presidential race, and you look at this district, you look at the west side of the district, the west side of Lansing, you look at the east side of this district, you're talking eastern Livingston County, and it's kind of that exurban area, and in 2022, we saw the Democrats make gains in both. Do you think this year they'll be able to maintain those gains, or with Trump on the ballot, we're going to start to see a little bit of a rollback?
I think it'll be very close to the presidential vote in the district. Again, you have a race with 2 quality candidates where you can't necessarily see one winning over a lot of supporters of the opposing party's presidential candidate. 2022 was a very unique year in Michigan because of the abortion ballot initiative. The electorate in 2024 will not look like the electorate in 2022, and this district will be quite competitive, even though it was made by the redistricting commission to be more of a Democratic-leaning district than it had been in the past.
Now, gentlemen, you look back at 2022, and Tom Barrett, of course, ran against Alyssa Slotkin. He is running again this year. He did not perform as well as the candidate did back in 2020 for the Republicans. Did Barrett underperform, or is Alyssa Slotkin just that good at organization and fundraising?
I mean, yes, is the answer. Barrett did underperform, and Alyssa Slotkin is that good. I got to know Alyssa Slotkin because I referred to her in the media shortly after she filed for, or after she won election to this seat as Mike Rogers in a skirt. I got a very angry phone call from her about that, and I had to explain that I meant that as a compliment. I like Mike Rogers. Alyssa Slotkin might as well have been grown in a laboratory to run for office in competitive seats, right? I think you can say the same thing about former Congressman Rogers. He's just been out of the game a little bit, and there's been a little bit of atrophy in the muscles. She's as high a quality candidate as you could get for this seat, and she performed like it. Former Senator Barrett did underperform here a little bit. There are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, and I say this with love in my heart, I like Tom a lot. My firm, full disclosure, was a consultant for him when he unseated a Democratic incumbent to become a state lawmaker in the first place. Tom's a bad fundraiser, always has been, and he underperformed in fundraising in that race, and it showed. It was the most expensive race, congressional race in the country in 2022, and Tom wasn't up to the task of raising the money that was required. The other thing was there were some fundamental strategic flaws in that campaign, and I can't illustrate that any better than an anecdote that took place GOTV weekend in that race. I was sitting in the front room of my house. I had the storm door open so the dog could see the sunlight, and I heard somebody rapping on the storm door. It was Tom Barrett, candidate for U.S. Congress, GOTV weekend, is knocking on my door in Dimondale. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a former consultant for Tom's legislative campaigns. I'm also a Democrat. I also, at the time, was working for a super PAC that was supporting Congresswoman Slotkin, which Tom knew, which means, A, he had a really bad list, right? Because if he sees my name on it, he's not stopping to talk to me. B, why is a candidate for the U.S. Congress knocking doors on GOTV weekend in Dimondale, a community that he has represented for a decade? Fine question. Why would you be doing that? And C, why did he spend 15 minutes on my door, GOTV weekend? So there were some strategic and tactical flaws in that campaign that caused him to underperform. And if they expect to win that district this time, they got to work all of that out. Color me skeptical.
There's no truth to the rumor that as a Democrat that Adrian didn't say, hey, come on in, stay for a little while.
I did have a labor leader that was texting me, you keep him on your porch as long as you can.
Adrian invited them in and they watched the entire Godfather trilogy. It was a 9-hour event, but...
Tom otherwise has a ton of great attributes as a candidate. I mean, he fits the mold right now of somebody, especially in the GOP, military background. He still wears the haircut, he still serves. He's got a great story to tell. He's got a young family, a young, attractive family that did great on some of their initial ads. I thought were hilarious and cute to try to build up a reputation of him. He also was running against like the national lead in small dollar fundraising for Democrats in Alyssa Slack, and he was never going to match that, but he does have to like up his game, that's for sure. This time around, he's up against something very different. Another bald white dude running for office, not Alyssa Slotkin, and that makes a difference. However, this time around, while Curtis Hertel, who had been in office previously in Ingham County, he's got a family network, not only as the network of having been a legislator, his family network of his dad and other family members serving in office across Southeast Michigan and Michigan, his brother serving in the Senate in Southeast Michigan right now. He just got done working for perhaps one of the presidential contenders for next time around, and then Governor Whitmer. He's got a lot of connections. He understands politics inside and out, and he's super hungry. So he may not have some of the rhetorical and other skills that Barrett has, but he presents a different kind of challenge than Slotkin did.
Yeah, so I told a story about Tom, so I got to tell a story about Curtis, and it's a story about Curtis that's actually a story about Carl Levin. So when Curtis said he was running for this seat, I mean, John just pointed it out, and of course I said this to Curtis's face because it's the kind of person I am. I was like, Curtis, I got to tell you this story that I heard in my American politics pro sem when I was a PhD student in Professor Grossmann's department before I dropped out of that program. That was told to me by Carl Levin. And Carl told the story about your former boss, Bill Schuette, when he ran against him for U.S. Senate. Carl was doing an event with a bunch of auto workers up in the Saginaw area. So he's got a few thousand people in a room, and Carl opens up his speech doing 5 minutes about how his opponent, Bill Schuette, you know, is much more attractive than him. He comes from money. He wears nicer suits than I do. And then Carl does another 5 minutes about how, you know, he's just a fat Jewish guy from Detroit. And he has a bad comb over, and, you know, I'm older than him or whatever. And then he pauses a beat. He looks out at the crowd and he says, I see a lot more of me out there than I do of him. I told that story to Curtis when he filed for this seat. And I was like, go get him, Tiger.
We're starting to come up to the end of our time here, but being that this is the House office building, I'd be remiss not to ask Dr. Grossmann. We've got some new legislative districts here for the House. How do we expect for these to perform? Are they going to make a huge difference in the final outcomes of the Republican versus D number, or is it more about actual representation?
Well, the statewide vote is very likely to be similar to the overall level of representation, and that means that the Republicans are favored to take back control of the House because Democrats won by only a very small margin in a year where the electorate was overwhelmingly in their favor, and all of the state legislative candidates underperformed the statewide candidates by 10 points collectively. So I would say it's going to be very close, but if you had to bet today, you'd bet that Republicans will take back control.
Arnold Weinfeld has a traveler, so he'll be going around to take your questions here. But before I let these gentlemen answer your questions, I do have 3 final questions of my own. First, who wins Michigan and who wins the White House?
I think as of today, you have to bet on Trump, on both.
Yeah, gun to my head, Donald Trump.
Betting today, yeah, Trump is the winner.
Trump's the winner. Who's our next U.S. Senator?
Slockin.
Hill Harbor. That's good, Mike Rogers.
This one's close, but I think I will say Mike Rogers.
Well, we'll start over here this time. The next Speaker of the Michigan House will be?
A Republican.
Yeah, Republicans are going to win, if you had to bet today.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Now, does anyone have any questions out in the audience? Right over here.
Hi, I had a question. I'm from the Midland area, and I was wondering if you could talk about the Kildee seat a little bit.
Sure. Speaking of candidates that might as well have been grown in a lab to win a competitive seat, Kristen McDonald-Rivet is as good as Democrats could have hoped for in that seat. You know, the biography's right, her married last name is right, everything about her is right for that seat specifically. She's also a pretty good fundraiser. Democrats have got to like their chances as well as they possibly could, given the fact that they're not going to have a Kildee on the ballot there for the first time in like 50 years longer. You know, the Kildee retirement hurts because they are going to have to spend time and attention on that. I do think ultimately that they're going to win that seat, but I'm sure John will tell you something different.
Well, the Republicans were recruiting Bill Schuette Sr. big time to run 2 years ago for that seat. They saw the numbers after it got redistricted and it wasn't great. I think, frankly, so did Dan Kildee. He saw the numbers. He had to raise a ton of money last time, and he ran. I liked his TV advertising campaign. Really built up his personality, but it was like, I don't know if it was like 25 ads or what, it was a ton. They had to do a lot of work to hold that seat. So the Democrats do feel they're fortunate with Kristen Rivet in that seat. You think sometimes in politics you watch people run sometimes over and over again to try to make it to office, and Kristen Rivet potentially could go from nowhere to state senate, so she skipped over all that other junior league stuff. And then I'm a House guy, so I'm just kidding. I worked here for 6 years, and then now we'll skip right into Congress. Like sometimes timing in politics, if not always, timing is everything. But it's a good candidate for the Republicans. Have a self-funder who ran previously, and so a lot of this is going to come down to how well Trump can do in that zone, and where did Trump go for his first visit, his first normal rally? He went to that district.
Other questions? Mary, he's coming right now.
Bill Schuette had a very similar story to that Carl Levin story, where he said that because he was always traveling all over the state as Attorney General. When I worked for him, and that somebody in a gas station stopped him and said, "Has anybody ever told you look a lot like Bill Schuette?" He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "You're a lot better looking than that guy."
I'd like to know from the three of you, really, I think that the major ad buys that you're talking about is on ABC, CBS, CNN, and Fox. What I'm noticing is the political ads on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and TikTok and also the streaming ads on that's not broadcast TV and it's not cable TV. Can you track that stuff? And if so, has it changed since 2020 to now? Can you track it?
Yeah, I haven't hired a person over the age of 30 in my firm in 7 years. Last person that we hired was a data engineer to implement AI solutions. Creepy digital geo-targeting is like our stock in trade now. So yes, you can monitor all of that and follow people around on their phones or target them based on where they were 6 months ago, like all of that. So yes, that can all be tracked. In fact, for the an interested party, you can go onto Facebook right now and pull up their ad library, right? And just see who is paying for your eyeballs and where. So yeah, even without much technical sophistication, you can find a lot of it, and you can find basically all of it if you know where to look. Yeah, in fact, a mark of how important that is for an advertising strategy now is that, when I call up my sales rep at Comcast about making TV buys, it's the first thing out of the mouth. Do you want to buy OTT, right, over the top? So ads that people are going to see when they pull up Netflix or Hulu or whatever streaming service or the ESPN app or whatever it is, because I want my ads to play unskippably there or be serving you, static display ads, if your eyeballs are the ones that I'm bidding on.
With that,
I was just gonna say, but the digital advertising numbers are a bit misleading because they combine fundraising advertising with general public advertising. So if you pulled up those Facebook ads now, you'd see a lot that were more targeted for fundraising, and especially the Trump campaign basically decided that if they raise $100 and spend it all on advertising, then it's worth it for fundraising wise. So some of the digital spend that you're seeing is for fundraising, not general advertising.
with that in mind, Adrian, with when the folks in this room tune in on October 26th to see the Michigan State Spartans beat Michigan in the game, what are we looking at for an average 30-second ad nowadays? So like 500,000?
That's adorable.
I do have dimples.
Yeah, it's gonna be more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's part of the reason that, like, if you're running statewide, you have to buy some television. There's no way around it. But I've been advising people against buying television advertisements for events like that. Buy streaming ads. Everybody's on their phones anyway. It's much cheaper to advertise to people on Twitter, on whatever sports sites they follow, or wherever they engage in the parasocial relationships that the tech companies use to market to us. That's where you want to get people because it's much more economical and they're actually engaging with something instead of just watching something go by on a screen.
Especially when most of us run to the bathroom or go to get another beer while that ad is running.
They all take their phones with them.
But I wouldn't say, I wanted to make a joke about they've invaded Pinterest. What? I'm joking, right? The Slackman campaign just started reserving their own TV and going on the air now. But the national Democrats already started at election day and started working backwards, making reservations. So television is not like out the window. They've already reserved $24 million in television ads to get them just at a minimum strong level from election day back to primary election day. So television is still a huge part of the mix, but certainly, as you're pointing out, you can't escape it no matter where you go.
Any other questions? One.
Yeah, I just wanted to pivot back to one of the other targeted races this year, based out of like the Lansing area. So do you think with not having Slotkin on the ballot for that race, there will be a notable difference there? Tom Barrett's running again, but this time it's a Hertel who also has a lot of favor in Michigan from the family that he's from.
Yeah, it's a negative impact for the Democrats to switch from a machine like Sellek is to Hertel, although Hertel and his background is really going to be helpful for them. But I tend to lean toward what Professor Grossmann said, is that the numbers overall in that district will probably match or look like what's in the presidential. So Donald Trump or Joe Biden may be determining if Tom Barrett makes it this time around.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. Congresswoman Slotkin has typically outrun the Democratic brand or the Democratic top of the ticket by a little bit in most of her races. And I think that you can expect to see Curtis be basically bang on the numbers there. The other disadvantage that he has is that he's not a woman, which is a thing of value in this district.
think we have time for one more question. We'll go right over here.
Making Arnold work.
With so many people complaining about the role of big money in elections, would there be any benefit for citizens to move our primaries up for important offices like US Senate to maybe April or May instead of first week in August?
I'm not sure what impact that would have on spending per se.
Maybe more so when
No,
it's spent.
who's
Yeah.
spending though? Is it the citizens or the huge money?
I mean, like the huge money always finds a way. Like I run a political consulting firm. We don't work with candidates. I don't even want to talk to those people. I have money. I'm pretty transparent about it. So I think ultimately, like the institutional investors in politics are always going to find a way to make institutional investments in politics. If anything, doing primary elections even further separated from other elections, it would just depress turnout.
Although we are unusual compared to other states. I mean, it's a good question because, like, say, for example, the Ohio U.S. Senate primary, which was a slugfest, a lot of money was spent, the polling was all wrong, the Trump candidate won easily. That was back in March.
Yeah.
And so they're going through sort of more of a quiet zone. So it may actually help us have a more enjoyable summer.
I changed my mind. I'm in favor.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We have, for those of you that are legislative staff, we will be having a legislative staff training next Tuesday, June 4th, here in the Mackinac Room, starting at 8:30. For everyone else, you're invited to our next IPPSR Forum and Lunch and Learn, which will be 2 weeks from today. That's June 11th. Same time, 11:45. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Grossmann. Oh, it's on economic development. Thank you, Dr. Grossmann. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, John.
All right. Thanks.